Okay, going back to Jean Harlow for a few minutes because I didn't have time to tell this story in part two, so you get it here. In the chapter that's titled Hollywood Myths or Famous Hollywood Myths in Lulu in Hollywood by Louise Brooks. Louise Brooks explains what she thinks is the origin of a famous myth in Hollywood that's supposedly it's said to be about Jean Harlow. And what happened is that Jean Harlow was supposed to have walked into a restaurant in Hollywood wearing nothing except a fur coat and sat down at the table at the restaurant and naked under her fur coat. And the interesting thing about this story is Louise Brooks, actually, the first question she asks is actually the first one that I thought of too, is that how would anyone know she was naked under the fur coat if she never took the coat off? Which seems it's a little too obvious, but it's something that I think is easy to overlook in something like this story. Louise Brooks herself was really fascinated by this story, and I think for maybe a different reason than why I would be fascinated with it. But I think more her interest in it had to do with the creation of myths in Hollywood. So she actually spent what sounds like, from reading Lulu in Hollywood, a couple of months investigating whether this event actually happened or not. And after that, Brooks, she lists about 5 or 6 reasons, and all of them are very realistic and plausible ones about why this story probably never happened. And I tend to agree with her, and I would like to add my own. I think because this story was said to have happened in around 1933 or 34, and that year, 1933, was basically the beginning of the paparazzi in Hollywood. Back then they were called scandal magazines, were following celebrities around trying to catch them doing naughty things. And I think what would have happened is that had Jean Harlow actually done that, and her dress accidentally popped open or she flashed somebody or something, which is what the suggestion of the story is, one of the paparazzi would have snapped a picture of it. But the other suspicious thing about it is that no one ever saw this event, and that in the search, the search for witnesses or something of whoever had seen Jean Harlow naked under her fur coat, no one ever came forward and no one ever saw anything. So that again makes me think this story is completely false, and it's some Hollywood publicist's wet dream. And it's the kind of story where whoever created this myth, and that's what it is, it's a myth, did a really good job in the sense that it's exactly the kind of thing we wish would happen, but it probably never happened. Another reason that this story couldn't have happened the way it was explained to have happened is that it's not possible that Jean Harlow would have been naked under her fur coat, because she would have also have had to have been wearing shoes, or they wouldn't have let her in the restaurant. This story, I think, is a really good example of Hollywood's early marketing and using made-up false publicity, I suppose you would call it, made-up incidents to sell an image, a false image, fill more seats in Jean Harlow's movies, and ultimately make more money for the studio. I think this story also hints at some of the Hollywood propaganda machine's darker side, because it also shows that while the businessmen there in Hollywood who were controlling everything by this point were willing to make up fantasy stories in order to sell pictures, they were also just as easily willing to destroy people's careers and spread false, basically slanderous certain actors' character in order to destroy their careers, which actually did happen. It happened to Louise Brooks. Things were said about her such as that she was difficult to work with and hated being an actress. Neither of those things are true, and can be easily proved false by not only her explanations of those stories, of the origin of those stories in her biography in Lulu in Hollywood, but also based on the testimony of other actors and crew people who worked with her. And from listening to the testimony of several of the actresses in the Weinstein trial, we can see that nothing has changed much in the current version of Hollywood. As soon as they weren't marketable anymore, or for whatever reason that Weinstein or the studio turned against some of these women actresses, their careers were basically destroyed, and they were discarded, exactly like what happened to Louise Brooks. One funny incident that happened on one of the sets of one of her films that the true version of what was told is explained by her, and it's somewhere in Lulu in Hollywood, and she talks about how on filming the hobo movie called Beggars of Life, it's one of the 3 films where Louise Brooks does some of her best acting. She really shows how talented she actually was in this film. And even her and the other lead, Dick Arlen, they hated each other in real life, and they both had to portray convincingly lovers in the film, and neither of them could stand the other. And one of the reason Dick Arlen hated Louise Brooks so much was because on another film they had worked together on a couple years before, Dick Arlen claimed he was a World War I flying ace or something like that. But he was obviously too young to have served in the military at the time that he claimed he was. And because they were both heavily intoxicated from consuming, I think, 3/4 of a bottle of whiskey, Louise Brooks basically shamed him and called him out as a liar when he tried to pass himself off in this story, and he hated her ever since. Another story that Louise Brooks says is true that happened on the set of this same film with Dick Arlen. She, after seeing an impressive stunt, a spectacular dive off of a moving train into this river below, Louise Brooks decided she was so impressed by this feat that she decided to, as an impulsive 21-year-old, to have sex with her stunt double, Harvey. And the next day, he, in front of everyone in the lunchroom, told them all she had given him syphilis. This story is actually true. Louise Brooks explains it did happen. This happened on the set of Beggars of Life, not Pandora's Box, not this film. I remember being a 20-year-old and doing a lot of dumb things, so Louise gets a pass on this as far as I'm concerned. But Louise does say about the making of this film that because she was also a young and dumb 21-year-old, she went out drinking every night until 3 in the morning, and when Bab's assistant would come to wake her up at 7 in the morning every day for shooting, she was obviously hungover. And Pabst got really tired of this, so he gave orders to his assistant to lock Louise in her room every night so she couldn't go out and hit all the clubs in Berlin. This scene here at approximately about 6 minutes into this clip, Louise says that because the actor that played Dr. Schoen, Fritz Kerner, hated her so much, she says that when he shook her in this scene, he left bruises on her arms afterwards. And when I watched this scene after reading what Louise says in Lulu in Hollywood, thinking about how much he hated her, I don't really see that much acting here. He's his dislike for her isn't hidden at all. In the previous act before this one, Dr. Schoen had attempted to take at least a break from his relationship with Lulu so he could keep her away from the upcoming wedding. And here we see, instead of what he's planned, Lulu has now skillfully eliminated her competition. Instead, in Lulu in Hollywood, Louise Brooks suggests that the Fatty Arbuckle scandal, in which ended his career, was well used by Hollywood and may have even been a setup, because the major studios were planning to get rid of Arbuckle because he was overpaid, and at the time silent movies were on the way out and talking films were on the way in. And Brooks explains because she was 21 years old at the time and basically in the prime of her career, the peak of her career, that the studios were getting rid of all their highly paid silent movie actors and either forcing them to take pay cuts to keep their contracts or replacing them with different actors for the talking films. And even she says that's why she didn't want to re-sign with Paramount, because they offered her the same amount of money for now doing twice as much work, in which from now on she would have to memorize a script full of lines for every film, in which she hadn't had to do that before. She also explains that the studios looked for any excuse to dump off overpaid stars. They purposely, she explains, destroyed the careers of Lillian Gish and Greta Garbo because, again, the studios thought they were overpaid. Another really famous myth that gets an entire chapter devoted to it in Lulu in Hollywood is the myth of W.C. Fields. And the reason this gets a whole chapter is because Louise Brooks and W.C. Fields, or Bill Fields as she calls him, were really good friends in real life because they had worked together both before and after they became famous. She first met Fields when they were both in the Ziegfeld show together, when he was the comedian doing routine stand-up in between the dance routines that Louise and the other dancers were doing. And they became really good friends. And later they actually worked together when they both were famous. So anyway, Louise Brooks knew Bill Fields quite well, and she says about him that the Hollywood story of him being a belligerent drunk who played a lot of cruel jokes on people, like, for example, there's a famous story of him filling a baby's bottle with whiskey, and Louise Brooks says that none of that stuff is true. The real Bill Fields that she knew was a really humble and quiet, solitary man who spent all his time alone. He was an alcoholic, but he drank by himself, and he only went along with this false image that the Hollywood publicists and the Hollywood people made up for him because he was so desperate to be famous. He went along with the lies that they made up about him. But Brooks explains that none of this stuff is true. Anyway, we can see from this little collection of stories that the lies of Hollywood go back over 100 years. But I think under a careful investigation, and enough of the facts are probably still out there to solve some of these mysteries about whether or not some of these certain events actually ever happened, I think a lot of these other myths could also be proved to be false. For example, think about the supposed lie that the Hollywood executives that hated Louise Brooks said that how much she hated acting. That's obviously false, because if you watch her performances, she obviously loved being in front of the camera. What she hated was, what she hints at in Lulu in Hollywood, was the Weinstein-like sexual predators who were using all the actresses for sex. And she says that was why she always dreamed about escaping Hollywood. It had nothing to do with hating making films. I think this film in particular actually shows how much Louise Brooks actually loved being an actress. Now, if you watch part 4, really remember and pay attention to this scene coming up in a few seconds, where Lulu and the Countess are dancing together. Because it's so close to the end of the clip, I don't have time to explain this part, but I promise I will have a lot to say about this in part 4. And I want to go back to Weinstein for a minute here, because my suspicion is that how widespread that Louise Brooks says that the practices of Weinstein were 100 years ago in Hollywood suggests to me, certainly that he's far from the only producer who was doing what he was doing. I think it's more or less the common practice in Hollywood among all producers. But what I think it was is that Weinstein was the most open and unashamed of what he was doing, and he wasn't careful enough to keep his little casting couch hidden, and he became enough of a joke in Hollywood and infamous enough that he was outed, and they've eventually now used him to say that, now that we've gotten rid of Weinstein, we've cleaned up Hollywood. But I seriously doubt that is the case. I think because the machinery is still in place, even though maybe a few of the key players are gone, and I think this behavior has now, over 100 years, become entrenched in the Hollywood system. For example, in the film Maps to the Stars, it features a character who, she's an Oscar-winning actress, and her mother was an Oscar-winning actress, and both extremely successful and famous, and yet she is forced to have a threesome with the director and his girlfriend in order to get a role that she wants. I think some of this is maybe based on actual events in Hollywood. If the script of the Maps to the Stars and a couple of other similar films that I can think of is based on some actual practices in Hollywood, it would certainly explain to me why certain actresses keep getting all the good roles, even though much more talented ones are available.